The HOA really thought they could put a hotel on my private island. One morning, the board president shows up with bulldozers, waving a bogus document and acting like she owned the sanctuary my wife and I built together. For months, I let them build. I watched as they poured concrete, raised walls, and even live-streamed their progress, laughing that I was too old and weak to stop them. But they had no idea I was letting them finish their multi-million-dollar project on purpose, all because of a secret my grandfather left me in a dusty old safe. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because watching their faces in court was priceless. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied by a power-hungry HOA, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story where justice is finally served. The mist was burning off the cove just the way Eleanor always liked, slow and quiet, leaving the water looking like hammered steel. I had a line in, more for the ritual of it than the hope of a catch. My casting rod was a permanent extension of my arm these days. On this little patch of land, my 1-acre island, time moved differently. It moved at the speed of the tides, of the sun creeping across the old oak where she'd hung the swing for Lucy. Every rock, every twisted pine root was part of a story that ended with her. She called it our sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach. For the 6 years since she'd been gone, I'd been its quiet keeper. My only job was to keep it safe. Then I heard the sound. Not a gull, not the wind. It was a high-pitched electric whine, like a giant mosquito. I looked up and saw it. A little quadcopter drone, hovering 100 feet out. Its camera lens, a black, unblinking eye, pointed right at me. The peace shattered. A moment later, the drone's buzz was drowned out by the roar of a motor, something big and obnoxious. A gleaming white powerboat, the kind realtors use to impress clients, sliced through my calm water and headed straight for my dock. It threw a wake that slapped hard against the pilings my grandfather had sunk back in the 50s. The boat's engines cut, and a woman stepped onto the dock like she owned it. She was all sharp angles and tight-fitting business clothes that seemed ridiculous out here. In one hand, she clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Marla Kent, the new HOA board chair. I knew her by reputation only. A former timeshare saleswoman who treated our quiet community bylaws like a personal kingdom to be conquered. She gave a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Rourke," she called out, her voice too loud for the morning stillness. "Lovely day for an inspection." I reeled my line in slowly, deliberately not looking at her. The drone dipped lower, its propellers stirring the air. I could feel its lens on the back of my neck. "I'm not aware of any inspection, Ms. Kent," I said, my voice flat. "This is private property." She took 3 more steps onto my dock, her heels clicking on the weathered wood. "Actually, the association is conducting routine shoreline assessments today," she said, tapping her pen on the clipboard, "for community safety and environmental compliance." She waved a single sheet of paper at me, a flimsy piece of printer paper that looked like it had been run off her home computer 5 minutes ago. "This is our official notice of easement. The HOA retains rights to all littoral property in this development." I knew the word littoral. It refers to the shoreline. I also knew my deed line extended 200 feet past the low tide mark, a fact established by a U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in 1898. Her paper was worthless, a bluff printed on cheap stock. Instead of arguing, I just watched. I've learned a few things in 40 years as a Coast Guard engineer. The most important is that you don't waste your breath on a storm. You measure it. You document its strength, you chart its path, and you prepare. So, I took out my phone. I didn't say a word. I just started recording. First, a shot of her boat tied to my dock. Then a slow pan up to her, standing there with her clipboard and her smug expression. I zoomed in on the piece of paper in her hand, trying to get the text in focus. She saw what I was doing, and her smile tightened. "Recording is a violation of community privacy rules, Mr. Rourke." I didn't answer. I just kept the phone steady. She huffed, then marched right past me, off the dock and onto the island itself, onto Eleanor's sanctuary. I followed her, my phone still held high. She trampled through the patch of wild roses Eleanor had spent a decade nurturing. She pointed at my tool shed, the one my dad and I built 30 years ago. "That's an unauthorized structure," she declared to her clipboard. "It's not on the approved architectural plans." I just kept filming. Her shoes were sinking into the soft earth, leaving deep, angry impressions in the moss. I made sure to get a clear shot of the footprints. Evidence. Everything was evidence. She was so caught up in her performance, in playing the role of the powerful administrator, that she wasn't paying attention to me at all. She saw a quiet old man who was easy to roll over. She didn't see an engineer who spent his life analyzing structural weaknesses. And her whole case, her entire little power trip, was built on a foundation of lies as shoddy as a sandcastle. She finished her grand tour, scribbling furiously on her papers. "You'll be receiving a full report with a list of violations and corresponding fines," she announced, marching back toward her boat. "I suggest you take them seriously. We're building a better, more unified community here." She thought she was delivering a final, crushing blow. But as she stood on the dock, I lowered my phone and looked past her, out to the mouth of the cove. My blood went cold. On the horizon, two massive flat-topped shapes were pushing through the water. They weren't pleasure craft. They were barges. And on their decks, I could make out the unmistakable silhouettes of a bulldozer and an excavator, their steel arms looking like claws against the morning sky. They were heading directly for my island. Marla saw me looking, and her smirk widened into a triumphant grin. Her little inspection was a fraud. It was the scouting mission before the invasion. She hadn't come to give me a fine. She'd come to watch my world get torn apart. The fines started arriving the next day. A crisp white envelope, delivered by certified mail, which felt like a deliberate bit of theater. Inside, on heavy HOA letterhead, was a violation notice. $200 for an unauthorized auxiliary structure. My shed. There was a grainy photo of it, taken by Marla's drone. The notice said the fine would be applied daily until the structure was removed. Every single day after that, like clockwork, another envelope would arrive. $200, $400, $600. It was a slow, methodical bleed, designed to wear me down with 1,000 paper cuts. I'd built that shed with my father when I was 16. Its wood was gray and weathered, but the joints were still true. It held my tools, my fishing gear, and 3 decades of memories. Now, according to Marla Kent, it was an enemy of the community. I called Sam, an old friend from my Coast Guard days who had traded his uniform for a law degree. I met him for coffee, laying the stack of violation notices on the table between us. He leafed through them, his brow furrowed. "This is aggressive, Jack, even for an HOA," he said, tapping one of the notices. "But it's the why that bothers me." I told him about Marla's visit, her phony easement claim, and the barges. He went quiet for a long time, just stirring his coffee. "Let me look at your bylaws," he finally said. "The new ones they passed last year." I dropped off the thick binder that afternoon. 2 days later, he called me back. His voice was grim. "You're not going to like this," he started. "Page 147, Section 8, subsection C. It's an annexation clause, tucked into a chapter about landscaping and common area maintenance." He read it to me. The language was dense, full of legal jargon, but the meaning was brutally simple. It gave the board the power to absorb and improve any non-compliant, adjacent, or literal parcel for the benefit of the community, provided the owner was in violation of other bylaws. They were using the fines from my shed as the legal hook to seize my entire island. "Nobody read it, Jack," Sam said, his voice laced with frustration. "They buried it in 200 pages of rules about grass height and trash can placement. It's a hostile takeover hidden in plain sight." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just about a hotel. It was about taking the island, her island, Eleanor's sanctuary. The paper cuts weren't the attack. They were the distraction. The real weapon was the fine. Print everyone had ignored. The community began to fracture. At the marina, men who used to greet me with a nod and a wave now studied their boat lines intently when I walked by. I saw Marla holding court near the mailboxes, handing out donuts and bright false smiles. One of my neighbors, a good man named George, whose fence was technically an inch over the property line, caught me by my truck one afternoon. He looked haunted. "Jack, I got a notice about my fence yesterday," he said, his voice low. "Marla mentioned, she said if I showed community spirit, she might be able to make it go away." He couldn't meet my eyes. "Just pay the fine for the shed, Jack. Don't make waves for the rest of us." He was afraid. They were all afraid. Marla was using their own homes as leverage, turning neighbor against neighbor. I was becoming the problem, the selfish hermit standing in the way of progress. Or, at least, standing in the way of everyone else getting a break from Marla's clipboard. Still, I had to follow the process. I had to show I'd done things the right way. I filed a formal, polite appeal. I attached a copy of the original building permit for the shed, dated 1983. I included photos showing it was well maintained and harmless. I requested a hearing before the board, as was my right according to the bylaws. The hearing was a joke. It took place in a stuffy, windowless room at the clubhouse. The board sat at a long table, Marla in the center, flanked by a nervous-looking treasurer and two other members who refused to make eye contact. I stood before them like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. I made my case calmly and presented my evidence. I spoke for about 3 minutes. When I was done, Marla didn't even look at my paperwork. She just smiled that razor-thin smile. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Rourke," she said. She leaned over and whispered something to the treasurer, who nodded quickly. "The board has considered your appeal. It is denied. The fines will continue to accrue." That was it. No discussion, no review of the evidence. The whole thing took less time than it takes to make a pot of coffee. I walked out of that room, the sound of their faint laughter following me into the hallway. They hadn't just denied my appeal, they had mocked me. They thought they had all the power. They thought their new rules and their new binder were the only law that mattered. That night, I sat in my workshop, the pile of fines on my workbench growing like a tumor. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, a feeling of utter helplessness. I had followed their rules, and they had laughed in my face. The law, it seemed, was whatever they decided it was on any given day. My eyes drifted across the room to the corner, where a heavy, dust-covered object sat beneath an old canvas tarp. It was my grandfather's safe, a massive iron beast from a bygone era, with a single combination dial. I hadn't opened it in 20 years, but I knew exactly what was inside. He'd made me memorize the combination when I was 12. "Some things are more important than money, Jack," he'd told me. "Some things are about holding the line." I got up, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I walked over and pulled off the tarp, coughing as a cloud of dust filled the air. I knelt down, my fingers tracing the cold, pitted steel. They had their flimsy bylaws, their paper threats, and their fearful neighbors. But in this safe, under a century of dust, I had the truth. The quiet ended at dawn. It wasn't the slow burn of sunrise, but the brutal, shuddering roar of diesel engines. I felt it before I heard it, a deep vibration that resonated up from the granite bedrock of the island, through the floorboards of my small cottage, and into my bones. Then came the sound, the teeth-rattling thud of a pile driver, the scream of tortured metal, and the constant angry growl of heavy machinery. They were here. The barges I'd seen were now moored just offshore, and a small army of men in hard hats was swarming my land. My sanctuary was now a construction site. Each day was an assault. They tore into the earth where Eleanor's rose garden had been, ripping out roots and leaving a scar of mud and diesel fuel. Huge steel pylons were driven deep into the ground, each impact shaking the pictures on my walls. The wildlife fled. The deer that used to graze by the cove were gone. The family of ospreys that nested in the old pine left their perch and didn't return. The island, once a living thing, was becoming a sterile platform of rebar and concrete. Marla Kent was a frequent visitor. She'd arrive on her gleaming boat, not in work boots but in expensive heels, her clipboard replaced by a smartphone on a selfie stick. She'd walk the perimeter of the construction, a safe distance from the mud, and live stream her progress reports. I'd watch from my window as she narrated the destruction with breathless enthusiasm. "And here you can see the foundation for our community-owned eco-lodge," she'd chirped into her phone, panning across the torn-up earth. "This is an investment in all of our futures, creating a beautiful, sustainable asset that every resident can be proud of." She never looked at my cottage. It was as if I didn't exist. To her, and to the people watching her videos, I was just a ghost haunting the background of her grand project. But I wasn't idle. While she was performing for her online audience, I was working. I set up my old survey equipment, the same gear I'd used for decades in the Coast Guard. I logged every trespass, every violation. I bought a sensitive seismograph online and set it up in my basement, meticulously recording the vibration levels from the pile driver, charting them against the local building codes. I took water samples from the cove every evening, documenting the cloudy runoff spilling from the site, proof they were ignoring basic environmental protections. At night, when the garish work lights turned my home into a prison camp, I used a light meter to measure the glare, another clear violation of local ordinances. I filled notebooks with data, times, and photographs. I was building a case, brick by methodical brick, just as surely as they were building their hotel. The strain was immense. The constant noise, the lack of sleep, the feeling of being under siege, it began to wear me down. The worst part was seeing the pain in my granddaughter Lucy's eyes. She came to visit one weekend, bringing a batch of cookies she'd baked, her face a mask of worry. She stood on my porch, looking at the skeletal frame of the hotel rising over the trees. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small, "this is killing you. Mom and Dad, we want you to come live with us. Just sell. Please. It's just land." Her words hit me harder than any fine or violation notice. She was right. I was exhausted. The fight was draining the life out of me. For a moment, I almost gave in. The thought of peace, of a quiet house far away from the grinding gears and Marla's smug face, was overwhelmingly tempting. I looked from Lucy's pleading face to the half-finished structure that desecrated Eleanor's memory. Selling would mean Marla wins. It would mean they could take what wasn't theirs through sheer bullying and fine print. It would mean Eleanor's sanctuary would be a footnote in a timeshare brochure. "Not yet, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick. "I can't, not yet." She hugged me tight, and I felt the tremor of a sob she was trying to hold back. That hug almost broke me. It was also the thing that saved me. It reminded me who I was fighting for. A few days later, I was watching them from my porch. They were using a crane to lift a massive concrete piling, preparing to sink it near the edge of the cove. I noticed the foreman, a man named Hank, yelling at the crane operator to hurry. They were behind schedule, I'd overheard them saying. Rushing is how mistakes happen. As the piling swung into place, I saw it. A dark spiderweb pattern of fractures near the top, where the lifting chain was secured, a manufacturing defect. The stress of the lift was causing it to fail. I stood up, shouting and waving my arms. "Stop! The piling is cracked! Stop the lift!" The workers ignored me. Just another outburst from the crazy old man. Hank shot me a furious glare, but just as he turned away, there was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot echoing across the water. The piling shuddered, and a huge chunk of concrete broke away, plummeting towards a young worker standing below. He was looking up, frozen in terror. I didn't think, I just moved. I sprinted from the porch, grabbing a heavy-duty ratchet strap from my tool shed as I ran. I hooked one end to the base of a solid oak tree, vaulted over a pile of rebar, and threw the other end to the stunned worker. "Wrap it around the base of that pylon," I yelled. He fumbled, but did as I said. I cranked the ratchet with everything I had, pulling a high-tension line just as the rest of the piling shattered. The steel cables inside held for a second, causing the broken mast to swing like a wrecking ball instead of falling straight down. It slammed into the tensioned strap, which groaned but held, deflecting the lethal payload just enough to miss the man. It crashed to the ground a foot from where he stood. The whole site went silent. Every worker, including Hank, was staring, first at the pile of rubble, then at the terrified young man, and finally, at me. In that moment, I wasn't the enemy. I was the only one who saw the danger, and the only one who knew what to do. The trust they had in Marla and the foreman had just cracked wide open. Saving that young man's life changed nothing for Marla Kent. In fact, it made things worse. The site was shut down for 2 days for a safety review, which put the project behind schedule. Her fury wasn't about the near-fatal accident. It was about the delay. My punishment arrived in another certified envelope. The daily fines for my shed had been doubled, retroactively. The letter cited a new emergency bylaw about actions by a resident causing project delays. They were inventing rules as they went along. A week later, a thicker envelope came, this one from my bank. The HOA had placed a lien against my mainland house. The fines, now inflated to an absurd number, were being treated as a legal debt. They weren't just coming for the island anymore. They were coming for my home. That was the moment I knew I couldn't just document and wait. I needed help. I drove to the county seat and walked into a small, unassuming office with a sign that read, Veterans Legal Services Clinic. Inside, I met a young attorney named Dana Lee. She was soft-spoken and looked barely old enough to have finished law school, but she listened with an intensity that I recognized. It was the same way a good engineer listens to a struggling engine, not just hearing the noise, but diagnosing the source of the problem. I laid out everything: the bylaws, the fines, the fraudulent easement, my logbooks, the water samples, the vibration readings. I told her the whole story, but I didn't tell her about the deed in the safe. Not yet. She just nodded, her face unreadable. When I was done, she said, "They're using a classic bleed-out strategy. They think you'll run out of money or spirit before you can fight back in court." She tapped the stack of my logbooks. "But you've given us the ammunition. We'll start with the environmental violations. It's a way to get a foot in the door without showing our full hand." It was the first time in months I'd heard the word "we." My next stop was 2 houses down from my own on the mainland. Walt Slater, an ex-Navy SEAL who worked as a medic, was in his yard, turning a pile of scrap metal into a surprisingly beautiful sculpture of a heron. Next door to him, Reggie Ortiz, another former SEAL who'd been their comms specialist, was on his roof adjusting a satellite dish. I knew them both well enough to wave to, but not much more. I walked up to Walt's fence. "Doc," I said, using the nickname I'd heard others use, "I need a private security consultation." He put down his welding torch and looked at me, his eyes taking in everything. "I'm not for hire, Jack," he said, his voice a low gravel. "This isn't a job," I said. "It's a neighborly request. My property is being trespassed upon continuously. I need a record of it, a clear, undeniable record." Reggie, hearing our conversation, had climbed down from his roof and was walking over. "What kind of record?" he asked. I looked at both of them. "I need a timeline of every single person and vehicle that sets foot on my land. I need it documented with geolocated, time-stamped evidence that will stand up in court." Reggie's eyes lit up. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That sounds like a fun little project," he said. The next weekend, my quiet little island became the most surveilled piece of property in the state. Reggie deployed a series of tiny, motion-activated cameras hidden in birdhouses and hollowed-out logs. He mapped the entire island with a high-precision drone, overlaying the live camera feeds onto a 3D model. Walt, meanwhile, took a different approach. He'd sit on my porch for hours, a pair of powerful binoculars in hand, just watching. He made the construction crew nervous. His quiet, focused presence was more intimidating than a dozen angry shouts. With Dana filing the formal EPA complaints and my SEAL neighbors building an ironclad record of the trespass, I felt like I was finally fighting back. But it was a silent, invisible war. On the outside, it looked like I was losing badly. The hotel was nearly finished. It loomed over the cove, a 3-story monster of steel and glass, 90% complete. The local news station ran a story on it, a puff piece celebrating Marla's vision. She stood in a hard hat, beaming into the camera, talking about community and progress. Then they cut to a shot of my little cottage, filmed from a distance. The reporter's voiceover called me a reclusive local man and a selfish hermit who was trying to stand in the way of a project that would benefit everyone. Watching that on my small TV, I felt a profound sense of despair. My neighbors thought I was a villain. The world saw Marla as a hero. The hotel was a physical reality, casting a literal shadow over my home. It seemed impossible that my quiet work, my logbooks and water samples, could ever tear that building down. A week later, Marla decided to celebrate her victory. She hosted a topping-out party on the half-finished roof deck of the hotel. It was an exclusive affair for the board members, a few key investors, and the local news crew. They had champagne, catering, and a string quartet. From my porch, I could hear their laughter drifting across the water. I waited until the party was in full swing, then I got in my small skiff and motored over. I tied up at my own dock and walked right up the construction ramp, past a surprise security guard. I was carrying a small, beautifully gift-wrapped box. I stepped out onto the roof deck. The chatter died down. Every eye was on me. Marla turned, her face a mask of fury. "You are trespassing, Mr. Rourke. I'm calling the police." "I just came to bring you a gift," I said calmly, walking towards her. "A housewarming gift of sorts." I held out the box. Her anger gave way to curiosity and a flicker of smug triumph. In front of all her guests and the rolling news camera, she couldn't resist the chance to publicly humiliate me one last time. She snatched the box from my hand and tore off the wrapping paper. Inside was a simple, elegant black frame, and in the frame wasn't a photograph of the island or a white flag of surrender. It was a high-resolution, professionally framed photograph of a single, ornate, embossed seal pressed into century-old paper. Underneath it, the date was clearly visible, 1898. She stared at it, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Then she threw her head back and laughed, a loud, dismissive sound. "What is this, old man? Some kind of joke?" She held it up for the camera to see. "Look, everyone! Mr. Rourke has brought us a history lesson." She laughed again, and her guests joined in, relieved. They thought it was pathetic. They thought I was beaten. But as I turned and walked away without a word, I knew she had just laughed at her own execution order. She just didn't know how to read it yet. Marla's laughter from that party was still ringing in my ears when Dana filed the lawsuit. It wasn't an appeal of the fines. It wasn't a complaint about the noise. It was a quiet title action, a legal move that doesn't just argue about rules or damages. It asks a court to make a final, binding decision on who holds true ownership of a piece of land. It was the legal equivalent of a depth charge, dropped silently into the water, set to detonate, and blow their entire operation to the surface. We timed it perfectly. The day after the topping out party, the contractor, Hank, submitted the final paperwork to the county for the hotel's certificate of occupancy. It was the last step before they could legally open for business. He walked the paperwork into the county clerk's office at 9 in the morning. At 10:30, a process server, hired by Dana, walked into the HOA's management office and served them the lawsuit. Marla was in a meeting, probably planning the hotel's grand opening. She accepted the papers with a dismissive wave, likely thinking it was just another desperate move from the old man. What she didn't know was that Dana was already at the courthouse. She'd filed a motion for a temporary injunction, bundled with 100 pages of my evidence, Reggie's surveillance logs, the vibration readings, the EPA complaints, all of it. Just after lunch, the judge read Dana's HOA motion. He didn't have to rule on the full case, just decide if there was enough evidence of potential harm and questionable ownership to press pause. He saw enough. At 2:15 p.m., the judge's clerk signed a temporary injunction, a legal order that froze the county's ability to issue the occupancy permit until our ownership claim was settled in court. The permit, which was supposed to be signed at 3 p.m., was suddenly worthless. The trap was sprung. The fallout was immediate. Marla's phone must have exploded. She had investors expecting a return, bookings she'd probably already taken, and a contractor who was now legally forbidden from finishing the job or handing over the keys. The project was frozen solid, bleeding money every single day. The first crack in her wall of support appeared 2 days later. Hank, the contractor, called me directly. His voice was tight with anger, but not at me. "She told me the title was clean," he said. "No preamble. My final payment from the HOA was due when the C of O was issued. Now I've got suppliers breathing down my neck and a payroll I can't meet. My guys haven't been paid in 2 weeks. He paused. "My company's lawyer says since you filed the ownership claim, I might have to sue you too. I don't want to do that, Jack. Not after, you know." I knew. He was talking about the young worker I'd saved. "You should talk to my lawyer first, Hank," I said, and gave him Dana's number. His crew, who had once viewed me with suspicion, now gave me quiet nods when they came to retrieve their personal tools from the dead site. The word had gotten around. The old man wasn't the problem. The lady with the clipboard was. Marla, predictably, went on the attack. Her strategy wasn't legal, it was personal. She went nuclear. She started a smear campaign on the community's social media page. Suddenly, anonymous neighbors were posting stories about how I'd threatened them. An email, supposedly from my account, circulated, filled with violent language and threats against the board. It was a clumsy forgery, full of phrases I'd never use, but it was enough to scare people. She filed a police report claiming I had personally threatened her, twisting the story of the gift I'd given her at the party into something menacing. A sheriff's deputy came to my door, looking uncomfortable. He asked me a few questions, I answered them calmly, and he left. It was pure harassment, a desperate attempt to paint me as an unstable villain and discredit me before we could even get to court. She was throwing mud, hoping something would stick. But while she was busy playing the victim online, we were preparing for the final act. She had planned a big media event, the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Even though the permit was frozen, she decided to go ahead with the ceremony for PR purposes. She invited local politicians, the news crews, and the whole community. She set up a stage and a podium right in front of the locked doors of her ghost hotel. It was meant to be a show of confidence, a way to pressure the county and project an image of inevitable success. The day of the ceremony was bright and sunny. Marla was in her element, dressed in a sharp power suit, shaking hands and beaming for the cameras. The board members stood behind her on the stage, looking smug. She stepped up to the podium and began her speech, talking about her vision, her dedication, and the bright future of their new community asset. Right in the middle of her sentence about overcoming obstacles, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled up quietly at the edge of the crowd. 2 deputies got out. They didn't go for Marla. They walked calmly through the crowd, up the steps to the stage, and approached the nervous-looking HOA treasurer, Edgar Bloom. One of the deputies handed him a thick envelope. "Mr. Bloom, you've been served." Then they moved down the line, handing identical envelopes to each board member, one by one, subpoenas. To appear in court and to produce every financial record, every contract, and every piece of correspondence related to the hotel project. The local news camera, which had been focused on Marla, swung around to capture the scene. The deputies were professional, quiet, but the message was thunderous. Marla's speech faltered, her confident smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. The crowd went silent. Her show of power had been turned into a scene of public humiliation. As the deputies walked back to their car, one of them made a slight detour. He walked up to a man standing on the edge of the property, a man wearing surplus tactical gear and a plastic HOA compliance badge, Officer Craig Duffy. The deputy leaned in and said something I couldn't hear. Duffy's face went white. He quickly unclipped his toy badge and stuffed it in his pocket. The theater was over. The real show was about to begin. The county courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, mostly with my neighbors, the ones who had sided with the HOA, the ones who had stayed silent, and the few brave ones who had offered me quiet support. They were all there to see the final act. Marla and the rest of the board sat at the defendant's table with a slick-looking lawyer in an expensive suit. They whispered to each other, looking annoyed, as if the whole proceeding was just a ridiculous waste of their valuable time. I sat with Dana at the plaintiff's table. In front of me was a single worn leather satchel. That was it. No stacks of binders, no complicated charts. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with a reputation for being impatient with theatrics, entered the room and everyone rose. She looked out over the packed courtroom, her gaze settling for a moment on the HOA's legal team, then on me. "Let's get started," she said, her voice sharp. "I've read the briefs. The HOA's case seems to rest on an annexation clause in their 2021 bylaws, and Mr. Rourke's alleged failure to comply with a fine. Mr. Rourke's case rests on, well, let's see." She looked at Dana. "Counselor, you may begin." The HOA's lawyer stood up first, launching into a long speech about community standards, property values, and the board's legal authority. He waved a copy of the thick HOA bylaws binder like it was a sacred text. He presented a mountain of paperwork, violation notices, minutes from board meetings, Marla's inspection reports. It was a classic snowstorm strategy designed to bury the judge in so much paper that she'd lose sight of the actual issue. The judge listened, her face a mask of stone, tapping her pen on her desk. When he finally finished, she looked at Dana. "Your turn." Dana stood up, calm and poised. She didn't walk to the podium. She just stayed at our table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My client's case is very simple. We will prove he has sole and undisputed ownership of the island, and we will do it in 3 simple steps. No binders, no confusing bylaws, just facts." She reached over and opened my leather satchel. First, she pulled out a single, large, yellowed document, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was the original 1898 deed, signed by the governor of the state, granting the island to my great-grandfather. "Step 1, Your Honor, the chain of title." She then presented a short, 1-page document. "This is a record of property taxes paid on this specific parcel, under my client's family name, unbroken for 124 years. The HOA has never paid a penny in tax on this land because they have never owned it." A murmur went through the courtroom. Marla leaned over and whispered something furiously to her lawyer, who was starting to look less confident. Dana continued. Step 2, the survey. She placed a large map on an easel. It was the official plat map for our entire community, the one the HOA used as the basis for their authority. Then, she took a clear plastic overlay, and with Reggie's help, placed it perfectly over the top. On the overlay was a single, bold red line. This red line, Your Honor, is the property line as described in the 1898 deed, verified by a licensed modern surveyor using GPS coordinates. As you can see, the HOA's official territory stops exactly 200 feet short of the island's low-tide waterline. They have built a $3 million hotel on land they have absolutely no legal claim to. The silence in the room was deafening. The HOA's entire case, their entire kingdom, was built on a map that proved they were wrong. Finally, Dana said, Step 3, the proof on the ground. She turned on the courtroom's large video screen. Your Honor, last week, my client's neighbors, both former U.S. Navy SEALs, used a commercial diving drone to locate and film the original 1898 survey markers, iron pins set in granite at the corners of the deeded property underwater. The GPS coordinates of those pins are a perfect match for the deed in our survey map. On the screen, crystal-clear video showed the drone's robotic arm brushing seaweed off a rusty, but unmistakably man-made, iron marker on the seafloor. The video overlay showed the live GPS coordinates. It was undeniable, bulletproof. The judge stared at the screen, then at the map, then at the HOA's lawyer, who was now pale and shuffling his papers with no idea what to do. His entire case had just evaporated, but Dana wasn't done. She called her only witness, Hank Muller, the contractor. Hank walked to the stand and was sworn in. Dana asked him one simple question. Mr. Muller, what did the HOA, specifically Ms. Kent, tell you about the ownership of the land before you began construction? Hank looked directly at the judge. She guaranteed me, in writing, that the HOA held a clear and undisputed title. She said the old man living there was irrelevant and would be gone soon. My contract was based on that promise. Now, my company is on the verge of bankruptcy because she lied. He then turned and looked straight at Marla. The hatred in his eyes was hotter than his welding torch. The judge had heard enough. She looked at Marla. Ms. Kent, do you have anything to say to this? Marla, finally realizing she was trapped, did what bullies always do when their power is stripped away. She lost control. She stood up, her face blotchy with rage. This is ridiculous. He's a senile old hermit, and those residents, she said, her voice rising to a shrill shriek as she gestured wildly at the gallery. They're all just ungrateful, lazy people who don't appreciate anything I've done for this community. Her own lawyer was trying to pull her back into her seat, but she shook him off. She had forgotten, in her rage, that the court stenographer was recording every word. She had forgotten about the hot mic on the witness stand, broadcasting her tirade throughout the courtroom's sound system. Her ugly, unfiltered contempt for the very people she claimed to serve was now on the public record for everyone to hear. The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. She didn't just rule in my favor. She brought the hammer down. The verdict was an immediate ejectment order. The HOA was legally a trespasser, and their multi-million-dollar hotel was an illegal structure. The judge ordered them to fund the complete and total removal of the hotel and restoration of the island to its original condition, entirely at their own cost. Then came the damages. For the months of harassment, the bogus fines, the property damage, and the legal fees, she awarded me treble damages, 3 times the estimated cost. The final number was $3.2 million. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Marla Kent, whose tirade had gone viral on local news sites before the court session had even ended, just stared blankly, her face a mask of ruined ambition. She had tried to bleed me out with $200 fines, and in the end, her arrogance had cost her everything. The demolition barges that arrived a month later were a welcome sight. Instead of bringing equipment to build, they were there to tear down. Hank Muller's crew, paid in full with a cashier's check from the HOA's now panicked insurance company, dismantled the hotel with a satisfying efficiency. They took it apart piece by piece, module by module, until nothing was left but the concrete pylons, which they then cut down to the ground. The whole ugly monument to Marla's greed was hauled away on barges, leaving behind only scarred earth. The fallout in the community was seismic. The HOA's insurance premiums skyrocketed to a level they couldn't possibly afford. Faced with financial ruin and the fury of the residents they had insulted, Marla and the entire board resigned en masse. They vanished overnight, their reign of petty tyranny over. All the fines against my property were wiped from the record. The lien against my house was dissolved, and my legal ownership of the island was now enshrined in a fresh court order, unassailable and permanent. That $3.2 million felt like a heavy weight. It wasn't my money, it was blood money earned through months of stress and heartache. I sat down with Lucy and my lawyer. We decided to split it. Half went into a trust to pay for my grandchildren's college education, ensuring they'd never have to compromise their futures. The other half, $1.6 million, I donated to a regional wildlife conservancy to purchase and protect sensitive wetlands just like my own cove. It felt right. The money born from the island's desecration would now be used to protect other sanctuaries. The fight had changed our neighborhood. People were talking to each other again, not as potential violators of some arcane rule, but as neighbors. At an emergency community meeting, they voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the HOA entirely. In its place, they formed a simple, voluntary neighborhood committee to handle the basics: road maintenance and plowing the snow. No more inspections, no more fines, no more clipboards, just common sense. Slowly, the island began to heal. I hired a local landscaping crew to help me repair the damage. We brought in fresh soil and carefully replanted the native ferns and wild roses. The deep scars from the bulldozers faded under a carpet of new green. Where the hotel once stood, I planted a memorial garden for Eleanor. Nothing fancy, just a simple stone bench surrounded by her favorite flowers, lavender and hydrangeas. The ospreys returned to their nest in the old pine. The deer, cautious at first, began to graze again in the meadow by the cove. The quiet returned. This past weekend, I hosted the first open house. I put up a sign at the marina that said, "Island Picnic, all welcome." I didn't know if anyone would come, but they did. Families arrived in their small boats, bringing coolers and lawn chairs. Even George, the neighbor who'd been so afraid, showed up with a potato salad and a shamefaced apology, which I accepted with a handshake. The kids ran through the grass, and their parents sat on blankets, just enjoying the peace. Lucy was there, beaming, serving lemonade and cookies. She looked at me across the lawn, and I could see the relief in her eyes. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a home again. That evening, after everyone had left and the last boat had motored away, I walked to the end of the dock with my old casting rod. The sun was setting, painting the cove in hues of orange and purple. The water was like glass. I didn't even bait the hook. I just cast the line out, feeling the familiar pull and release, the same rhythm I'd felt 1,000 times before. I stood there for a long time, the quiet wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I thought about Eleanor and the promise I'd made to her all those years ago. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, and it felt like an answer. "We kept it safe," I whispered to her across the still water. "We kept it safe."